بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you for the opportunity to share. Sheikh Shinawi and I actually have this thing in common, that each of us has a personal connection to the Bosnian diaspora. That the first place that I went to after graduating from Medina, I went to Utica, New York, and Utica is a very large Bosnian population. Actually, in fact, Utica as a Rust Belt city was pretty much completely rebuilt by Bosnians. That in the 90s, Utica resembled many post-industrial small cities in America. The blocks and blocks of downtown were boarded up, drugs and gangs had moved in, and the refugee resettlement program in Utica, which primarily at that time, 95 and onwards, served Bosnians, brought tens of thousands of Bosnians to the area, Syracuse and Utica. And Bosnians being very, very capable and handy people, usually knowing the building trades and just about how to do everything, completely rebuilt the city. And that's something that's not lost on the people of Utica today. In fact, the unofficial nickname of Utica is the city that loves refugees, because of the debt that even people who have been there or their families have been there for decades and decades and decades or generations recognize the value that was added to that place by the Bosnian refugees. And there's an interesting, there's an interesting lesson there when it comes to Muslim communities and what value we offer and how we contribute to the society around us. There's a lot, I have to apologize for two things for this presentation. One is that the preparation was very rushed. This is largely an unscripted talk, so we'll see my improv skills. And second, because of international travel and pressure and targeting, I don't have all the photos with me or the videos that I had. I had a burner phone. I got rid of everything. I factory reset before I came back. And in the mix, I lost a lot of some of the things that we saw there, unfortunately. But I'm hoping to give a general overview of a little bit of history, not just pure history, a little bit of what we saw, a little bit of my reflections. SubhanAllah, it's no coincidence at all that in the last few days we've been hearing about Kashmir more in the news and the escalations that are happening in Kashmir. There is a structural similarity and resemblance between Kashmir and Palestine and Bosnia and many of the other places in the Ummah. And we'll talk about that a little bit. What is the common thread that runs between all of them? The logic of ethno-nationalism, how it creates this imperative for homogeneity and ethnic displacement or ethnic cleansing and genocide and partition. That this is a playbook, and it's a playbook that has been experienced by Muslims all throughout the world. It's being experienced by the people of Kashmir right now, and the people of Palestine, obviously, and it was also and still is experienced by the people of Bosnia. Now, this is an interesting thing. We'll come around to this full circle at the end. That a lot of people think about what happened in Bosnia as the past, but for the people who live there, it's still very much a living present, and it's always a very possible future. That people in Bosnia live under no delusion that things could escalate and return to a similar situation in the 90s at any moment. And in fact, this actually happened shortly before us going there. The opening image I have here was taken from one of the murals in Sarajevo. I'm going to get to that as well, but I guess let's go through a little bit of background. If you're not familiar, you got completely zero background on Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the official name. It's two regions technically, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I have to redeem Sheikh Shinawi. The J in Bosnia is pronounced like a ya, right? So it's Banja Luka, right? Not Banja. If you're Bosnian here, don't take it out on the Sheikh.
I said Sarajevo correctly.
Yeah. So I just have, we're teamwork,
Appreciate it.
So if you have no exposure, the Balkans, right, is part of Eastern Europe. This is the political map today, so you can see the location of Bosnia and Herzegovina in that region. It's right across the sea from Italy It's near Montenegro and Croatia and Serbia, Hungary, and similar nations. It used to be part of Yugoslavia. So if you know anything about your history of the 20th century, Yugoslavia was a communist state that started out aligned with Stalin and then eventually broke with Stalin. The leader of Yugoslavia for the longest time was known as Tito, and it was a conglomerate of all of these nations. So the significance here, if you're a history nerd, is that Yugoslavia was not technically an ethno-nation state. It wasn't like France is for the French and Germany for the Germans. It was understood that there were many ethnicities that were living in this place, but because it was communist, the hope was that this is something that the communist ideology would hold people together. And similarly, I think that it's interesting when I look back on history. And by the way, I've co-authored an Islamic history book that should be coming out, inshallah, later this year. We should do something when that gets released. But it's very rare these days to find nations that are founded upon ideologies or values or principles. The going trend is the ethno-nation state. So again, France for the French, Italy for the Italians, etc. But Yugoslavia was similar to, let's say, the Soviet Union and other Soviet-aligned republics, quote unquote, at the time, is that it was supposed to be based off of the communist ideology. Of course, since it was based off of the communist ideology, Islam was repressed. And there are many folks that can tell you in the Balkans and in Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular that they had to bury their Qur'ans underground. They had to be very, very secretive with how they passed on the knowledge of Islam. Now, things were not, at least what Bosnians tell me, not quite as bad in Bosnia and Herzegovina as it was in other places such as Albania or even Central Asia, but still, the communist state as an atheist ideology and an aggressively atheist ideology was very much anti-religion and very much anti-Islam. Here's a physical map. All of the political aspects of this are incorrect, but just pay attention to the physical map here, okay? If you can't imagine, like if you think Pennsyvlania is beautiful, like subhanAllah, like Bosnia is just almost an entire nation of mountains and rivers and forests. Seriously, one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful places you'll ever see. If you look at the very, very north where the green is and the very, very south where the green is, that's when things unfold into farmland or farmable land. But the vast majority here, right in the middle, it's very hilly, it's very mountainous, fresh running water. It's everywhere you look is a picture, is a postcard. I should say a little bit, but this isn't my specialty, but we were told by our local guide there, who, by the way, our local guide was an Imam and was a Hoja, so he was a teacher in one of the mektabs in Travnik. And we'll talk about Travnik towards the end, because that was one of the places that we went. So he has 200 students under him. And he also is a professor and a tour guide. So he was a big history buff and really, really the highlight of the trip, honestly. He was absolutely fantastic. He explained to us how the process of Islam coming to the Balkans in particular, and literally Bosnia was the frontier. So we talk about like the name of Western Bosnia, they call that Bosnia Krajine. It's like the Bosnian frontier. Like this was the furthest extent, not necessarily of the political control. Yes, it often was for the Ottoman Empire, but certainly of the spread of Islam. Because we know that the spread of the political control of Islamic nationhood or Islamic governance is different than the spread of Islam itself. And la ikraha fi din, there's no such thing as forced conversions in Islam, so those two processes are separate. And if you want a good book on the difference between those two processes, Richard Bullitt, B-U-L-L-I-E-T, wrote a book about the spread of Islam and demonstrating how, contrary to European accusations, Islam spread not by the sword, but through a gradual organic process that usually took about 200 to 400 years after a land would become politically governed by Muslims, that it would slowly start to then have a Muslim majority. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is no exception. In fact, some of the Christian groups that were located in Bosnia and Herzegovina before the Ottoman Empire came, they were almost like muwahid. they were called the Bogomils, and they were accused of heresy by both the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. So it's said that before even Muhammad al-Fatih came to conquer the land, that there were 40,000 Bosnians who had accepted Islam because they found the transition between their relatively Unitarian version of Christianity to be very, very similar to the Islam that was coming and spreading. Of course, the Ottoman Empire would lose the Balkans in the late 1800s to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire through negotiation. This is part of a long process that we don't have time to get into now. You can wait for the book, inshallah. But during that process, actually, Bosnia and Herzegovina didn't fare so bad under the Austro-Hungarians. The particular ruler in charge at that time invested quite a bit in the area and understood enough to leave Islam alone. However, it was also the site of the outbreak of World War I and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. In fact, they have the exact place where the assassin stood, and they have his cement footsteps where he stood to assassinate the Archduke. Maybe we'll get into it, maybe we won't. The first place that we went and the most time that we spent was in Sarajevo. Sarajevo is in the central eastern part of the country. It's extremely mountainous. When we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnia is considered the northern part. It's very mountainous. It's a little bit cooler. And Herzegovina is the southern region that's much more Mediterranean. And you could think like California. Seriously, it felt like California. We said that Bosnia, the vast majority of it is mountainous, and this is particularly significant politically in the 90s when it came to Sarajevo and the siege of Sarajevo. So what happened after Yugoslavia fell apart and the Soviet Union fell apart and the communist experiment was brought to an end was that one by one, these nations that used to make up Yugoslavia declared their independence from Yugoslavia and attempted to break off and form their own ethno-nation states. The first one to do so was Slovenia, and then after that Croatia, and then after that Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, the group that did not want this to happen were the Serbs. Okay? And the Serbians they had this idea that goes back actually surprisingly far of Greater Serbia. If you're a political science major or you're a nerd like I am, I'm both of those things, that there's a term called irredentism. Irredentism is when a group of people has an ideological belief that their rightful lands are more expansive than their current lands. So the idea of Greater Israel, that's an irredentist concept. Even under Mussolini's Italy, Mussolini used to tell the Italians that they rightfully owned basically Croatia, the Dalmatian coast on the other side of the sea, and other territories, and Libya, etc. This is irredentism. So Serbians, the idea of Greater Serbia is an irredentist belief that Serbians have held for a surprisingly long time, believing that essentially what was Yugoslavia is rightfully supposed to be part of a Greater Serbia. So when all of this happened in the early 90s, we're talking about 91 and 92, the Serbs did not want any of these nations to break off. And one by one, they would attack all of these nations and open up several fronts of warfare against them, against the Croats, against the Slovenians, and of course, against the Bosnians, also against the people of Kosovo, which have a disputed border with Serbia and also with Montenegro. They were ready to fight everybody, basically, to put together this idea of Greater Serbia. The problem, and this is one of the interesting things and one of the structural similarities that we're talking about between Kashmir and about Palestine and about Bosnia, is that Greater Serbia is an ethnic project. It's a nationalist project. In the Ottoman Empire, you had tons of ethnicities, and you had multiple religions, and it was understood that anywhere where the political boundary that said, if you look at a map, Ottoman Empire, that you would find multiple types of people. There was not an expectation that there would be homogeneity, that everybody would be, or the vast majority of people would be of one particular ethnicity, or even less so, that the government itself would represent the will of that particular ethnic nation. This was the product of nationalism. Nationalism was mostly accomplished through the 1800s and then after World War I. And the project of Greater Syria as a nationalist ideology seeks to displace and to subdue anybody who would challenge the project of Greater Syria, especially if you're not Serb. So the process of ethnic displacement and ethnic cleansing and genocide is part of the DNA of these types of movements, such as Greater Israel, such as Greater Syria. In fact, it's barely indistinguishable when you talk about what the Serbs did and what they're doing and what they're trying to do, and the project of Greater Serbia. It's barely distinguishable from the Zionists and barely distinguishable from the project of Greater Israel. The parallels are so deep and genetic. They're not superficial. They're right to the core. That Serbia, essentially, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, resorted to all of these tactics in order to achieve its project of Greater Serbia. So, Sarajevo, being a place that is surrounded by mountains, imagine if you had heavy artillery lining up on the crest of all of those mountains, raining down, hurling down bombs and shooting and snipers and everything. That was essentially the situation that Sarajevo was in for 3 years. Sarajevo was under siege by the Serbs who had surrounded them for 3 years. What was the only way that the Bosnians had nothing. They had no weapons. The Bosnians will tell you they were completely unprepared for this type of aggression. They didn't know, some of them said while we were there, they had no idea how to hold a gun, no idea how to shoot a gun. They had no knowledge of this. And all of a sudden, like Sheikh Shinawi was telling us, even about learning Tawheed or learning these things, it's OJT. They're learning as things are happening in real time. One of the engineers, or one of the Bosnians that was an engineer, suggested, let's dig a tunnel under what's now the runway of the airport of Sarajevo, a 2-kilometer tunnel from besieged Sarajevo to the rest of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was still free, and once they were trying to fight back with whatever military forces that they could muster. They successfully did this, and that was the only way that Sarajevo was able to hold out. And even more impressive was that it was able to be kept a secret. For over 3 years, the Serbs could not figure out how the Bosnians were surviving, and they could not figure out the location of the tunnel. I have a video of going through the tunnel because they have restored part of the tunnel for you to go through. So you can see here's, Sarajevo has a heavy imprint of Ottoman architecture and lots of beautiful things to look at. Will this thing play? I don't think it will. Not with how we have it here. Khair, inshallah. Anyway, so
They call it the Tunnel of Hope, right?
what's that?
Tunnel of Hope.
Yeah, they call it the Tunnel of Hope. Okay, so they have restored part of the tunnel. You can go inside. They have lots of historical facts and explanations, and this is so recent that you have people there that give talks and give speeches to explain to you what it was like. One such figure we had, this brother, who wrote a book, Brother Harun, gave us a very, very moving speech. He was a commander, and actually I have the book with me. Alhamdulillah, customs did not take it from me. He gave me this book detailing his experience. He was 22 years old when this happened. He became a commander in the army of Sarajevo during the siege within a handful of months. And he talks about some of his experiences within it, and also talks about, like Sheikh Shinawi was talking, the Islamic element, that you had people that were coming from different parts of the Muslim world in attempt to help. In fact, we'll talk about this at the end, inshallah, part of the unsatisfying conclusion to the war, though obviously Bosnians were happy to end the fighting, but the terms upon which the fighting was ended were not very favorable to the Bosnians. That this was partly because Europe and America were terrified and did not want a armed Muslim, like Islamic country in Europe. And there's other movies, if you want to look into some of the literature, there's films out there that demonstrate various things about how the UN and the Dutch and even the Canadian forces and many of the international peacekeeping forces that were sent to Bosnia during the war actually inhibited the Bosnians from fighting back. They demilitarized them, they took their weapons, and basically did the Serbs' work for them. And it was only once the Bosnians started retaking their land and winning that then the US came in and say, okay, let's let's form a peace and let's come to a power-sharing agreement. If you've gone through the Hijaz, so the 5 years I spent in Medina, you'll find in places all over these qila, right? These fortresses that the Ottomans had built, and they are not maintained whatsoever. They're usually just left and abandoned. You'll find many of these throughout Bosnia, except with the exception that they are maintained, and they do have people who care for them. Amazing views, as you can tell. When we went south, so if you, let's see here, I want to sort of orient you with the map. We have the major cities, I guess you can tell here. The major cities, we have Sarajevo right there, about central east. Srebrenica is far east, over here towards the border with Serbia. You have Mostar, which is very famous for the bridge in the south. That's in Herzegovina. You have major cities like Bihać in the far west. We didn't go that far west, but slightly west we have Travnik. We did go there. And that's mostly where we went. So as you get further south, you run into more mixed territories, almost where they're half and half between Croats and Bosnians. And Bosnians, of course, are Muslim, and Croats are Roman Catholic. This is a church, and this was outside of our window from where we were staying in Mostar. Now, one of the really interesting things, I didn't take a picture of it because I found it so offensive, but the Croatian population, with the help of the Croatian government, put a giant cross, like think about like Brazil, right, the statue of Jesus, like a giant cross on top of one of the mountains that's almost opposite this mountain to the right in this picture, in order to basically be a symbol and trying to impose and intimidate the Muslim population. And the local leader, I think the mayor of the area at the time, who was a Muslim, was asked, and there's a period of very high tension, and he was asked what he thought about the Croats putting up this huge monument to Christianity. And in typical sardonic East European humor, he said, I think it's a big plus for us.
I get it.
Yeah. But so this is, I think, I like the story because it demonstrates both the tension, but also the sense of humor and how people survive the tension and survive these types of things. Bosnians understand very, very clearly that if the Serbs were given the opportunity, that they would go right back to 94 in a heartbeat. And yet people still have a sense of humor about it, a sense of levity. Yes, there is a lot of concern, but as one of them said, as one of the brothers in Srebrenica actually told us, and we have some pictures from Srebrenica in a second, he said that they were able to do everything that they did to us, but we won, and we weren't prepared. He said, this time, we're prepared. So we're not afraid of what's going to happen. And indeed, that brother Harun, who wrote the book, who was one of the commanders during the siege of Sarajevo, he told us a very, very moving story similarly. He said, and I know the brothers here in Pennsylvania will appreciate this, he said that his daughter recently got married, and the mahr was a Glock 45. He said, because we're not going to let this happen again. There's a sober understanding of the people of Bosnia of what they went through. There's a lot of hardship, a lot of trauma, but also a sober realization that no one's going to come and help them. And even the Bosnians, they'll tell you that how things unfolded politically, even the Muslim nations, yes, individual Muslim fighters came, but the Muslim nations were pretty much waiting to see what was going to happen. They didn't really rush to help Bosnia. And so they learned very quickly that they only really had themselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to rely on. When we went, this is Travnik. Okay, so Travnik is considered one of the more religious cities. It's slightly west of Sarajevo. It was an absolutely incredible place to be. We were able to catch a janazah in the masjid. We were able, outside of this masjid, which is called the Painted Masjid because of all the colors, on the left side, under the arcade, there was a cafe there. And the brother running the cafe was from Srebrenica. And we asked him, like, how are things going? And he said, things are very, very tense right now. Just as we saw the escalation happening in Kashmir, very, very similar things are happening in Bosnia right now. There's a lot of, saber rattling, right? People are saying stuff, inflammatory language. And even to the point where he told us that families that are in the villages, because Srebrenica is a village and it's also a larger area. So in the larger area of Srebrenica, he said that families were gathering together in groups of like 10 or 20 families and sleeping in one central location because they're not sure what's going to happen. They're on the front line. They're right there. Serbia's right, in view from eastern Bosnia, especially in Srebrenica. And so there is definitely a palpable fear in the country. We also saw some examples of solidarity. This is in Travnik as well. And this is inside of the masjid where we prayed janazah. You can, if you've seen the Ottoman architecture throughout Turkey and the other Ottoman lands, you're familiar with it. The difference I saw in Bosnia was the colors, that they had a lot of bright and popping colors that was different from what I was used to. This is the genocide memorial in Srebrenica. So we'll talk about this map in a second, but if you want to see here, Srebrenica is way to the east, this little enclave that's basically surrounded on three sides by Serbia. So you can imagine Srebrenica is the front line. Now, when I was in Utica, there's three Bosnian mosques in Utica, and one of them, the Imam, is from Srebrenica. His name is Ahmedin Memovic. And he was about 9 years old when the attack and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide in Srebrenica occurred. And he was one of the many people that fled to the forests and the woods and lived in the woods for weeks, trying to find his way to a safe place. Because at this point, the Serbs had, if you want to see a movie, there's been a film that was put out that we had a showing of that in Utica. It was called Quavodis Aida, which is in Bosnian. So, one thing that it shows very well is how useless the UN was and how the Serbs essentially instrumentalized the UN to take away weapons from the local population to leave them defenseless. And subhanAllah, the tour guide that we had with us, I didn't take pictures of this because it was indecent, but he showed us the room. First, there was a Canadian, not a full platoon, there was a Canadian detachment that was sent, and then eventually they were replaced by a Dutch one. He showed us the room that the Dutch soldiers were staying in. And he showed us the graffiti on the wall that the Dutch soldiers had drawn. And when I tell you and swear by Allah that they were drawing pictures of naked women, and they were drawing pictures and writing things that were insulting to the local Bosnian population about their teeth and about how they smelled and about various things. These were the people that were entrusted to protect the people of Srebrenica. So you can imagine how that went. And you can imagine, it reminded me of the ayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوهُ تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. That the people who are enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are assistants of one another. They help one another. If you don't do the same, then there will be fitna, there will be trials, and there will be great corruption on earth. That you could see, and it's still up today, you can walk into it, you can still see, it's right up on the wall, the contempt and the disgust that these supposedly enlightened Europeans had for the people of Bosnia. It's a very, very moving and emotional memorial that they have. Actually, things were so tense in Bosnia that it had been closed for 2 or 3 weeks before we got there. They had just reopened that week to normal tours. And they showed us a movie, and if you've seen some of the things, of course, we have some kids here probably. I'm not going to repeat some of the grotesque and horrible things that were done, especially to the women, but you can imagine that the local population, essentially, you were one of two scenarios. Either you were living in the woods and running for your life and trying to find a way back to a safe zone. So when I say about a safe zone, that all the dark green here is Republic Srpska, and this is the area that more or less was taken over by the Serbs during the aggression. And then the light green was the area of free Bosnia and Herzegovina. Okay, and you can see that Sarajevo is right on the border. So there were people running for their lives in the woods trying to find their way to safety. And then there were people that were sitting ducks like fish in a barrel that were in camps and they were slowly starved and tortured and ended or had worse done to them. So this is the memorial. So there's this memorial with the grave sites, and there's, I think, 8,000, over 8,000. This is celebrated not celebrated, it's commemorated rather, every July 11th. And if even you don't have the ability to go to Bosnia, you can go up to Utica or Syracuse, and you can take part in the march every July 11th, where they commemorate the end of the genocide after all of this ended, and finally the people of Srebrenica were liberated from their oppressors. But it's very, very emotional, as you can tell. They have a museum where they have all of these things intact. It is in the same barracks that the UN, it was set up in order to protect the people there. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the status quo and what happened after. So as I mentioned before, once Bosnians started really organizing themselves and fighting back and winning, and just when they were starting to look like they were going to prevail, and it's more complicated than that. Anybody who's Bosnian here, I know I'm not even going to go into the West Bosnian thing and what happened, but to tell a simple story, when they started getting very close to prevailing, that was when the Western powers intervened and said, okay, hold on, now everybody has to come to a power sharing agreement. And if you're familiar with some of the power sharing agreements, say in Lebanon or in other places across the world, where you have token representation of this group and that group and that group, but each of them sort of destabilize and disempower the other, this is really the status quo of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it has been since 1995 when these Dayton Accords were signed. Essentially, what you have, if you imagine the United States of America as 50 states, you have two main states in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You have the Republic Srpska, which is literally it's called the Serb Republic inside of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the dark green. And then you have the light green, which is called the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, they have different laws in between them, and they have different leaders in between them, and as you can imagine, the situation between them is very, very tense. You will go through, even Sarajevo, which is on the border, if you go through eastern Sarajevo, you will see Serbian flags flying. Now imagine that you are Bosnian, and these are the people who attempted to ethnically cleanse you from your land and genocide you, and your neighbors are flying their flags. I mean, it's like when you go out and you see an Israeli flag here, right? It's no different. So this is a very, very tense situation. The Republic Srpska is obviously funded and supported by Serbia itself. There's a high degree of integration between the two, and they are constantly assuming a type of belligerent or provocative stance when it comes to the entire state of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a whole. The nation cannot function without a leader from each, but since it's divided, then neither of them actually really prevail. So two things I'll conclude on here, because we're getting close to the Adhan, and then maybe I guess if we have any questions before the Adhan, I guess we can take them, is that one is which one to start with first? I think I'll say that what do the people of Bosnia want, and what are some of their struggles? So the obvious struggle is the incursion of the Serbs and the incursion of Republic Srpska, and this sort of mentality that they have that, like there was one meme that one of the brothers showed me, okay, that's been spread on social media in the Bosnian language and the Serbian language, in the Slavic languages, where it was a crowd full of niqabis. And the text read, "Grandpa, why don't you do anything to stop this?" This is the type of inflammatory stuff that's being passed around the internet in order to sort of gear people up or gin people up to do something about it. And of course, in this country and in other places in the world, we all know what that means. But there's other challenges that the entire region suffers from as well. One of the things that surprised me was that the entire region is undergoing depopulation. That there was this war that was fought, you've got Croats, you've got Serbs, you've got Bosnians, and the youth are leaving for Germany and Austria and Switzerland to go find jobs and to go live abroad and not coming back. That the sacrifice that was made from the older generation, it's in doubt whether that sacrifice will be protected long-term or not. And it's almost sad to see that without a necessarily really compelling economic reason, but for the grass is greener on the other side, many, many people leaving from all sides, the area. There is, I don't know what to say, there's a lack of sense of civic, let's build this thing together, but it certainly is a challenge, the depopulation. Another challenge is being forgot by the Ummah. And that was something that Bosnians communicated regularly in our time there. Feeling like the Ummah doesn't see Bosnia, doesn't think about Bosnia, and doesn't care about Bosnia. That feeling like if things were to break out once again, that they would be in a very similar situation where people would just be looking on, maybe seeing are these people going to survive or not, and not able to really help or integrate or anything else. We had a small taste, unfortunately, of this when it came to the tourism industry. So people are starting to discover Bosnia as a tourist destination. But as you know or could guess, any tourist economy is geared towards the tastes of the people who are visiting. And let's just say that there were a lot of paraphernalia that had to be removed from my hotel room before I was comfortable being there, whether it was alcohol, whether it was advertisement for a strip club, or anything else. You get the sense that Bosnians don't necessarily want to do that or to put that on, but the type of people who are visiting, they feel compelled to because nobody else is coming. So many people expressed to me the wish that Western Muslims would come more to Bosnia to see it, so that the tourist industry would be more Islamic and the people visiting the country would be more Islamic, rather than the type of clientele that is currently coming. Let's see, we're just about the adhan. And that's pretty much, I guess, all of it. I guess the last reflection is that one of the things when we try to make an intellectual case for Islam, well, we'll end on this. This will be bring together Kashmir and Palestine and Bosnia and Herzegovina. When we try to make an intellectual case for Islam, Islam is one of the only systems of governance and ways of life that is not predicated upon the extermination of the other. That when you look into the project for Greater Serbia or Greater Israel or any of these other projects that are based in ethno-supremacy or religious supremacy, you find that they cannot exist without exterminating the other. Greater Syria cannot happen without the extermination of the Bosnian Muslims. What did I say? Syria?
I said Greater Syria.
Okay, Syria? Serbia, excuse me. Yeah. Greater Serbia. Greater Serbia cannot exist. I've been reading a lot of Syrian news lately. Almost done. Greater Serbia cannot exist without the extermination of the Bosnian Muslims. Greater Israel cannot exist without the extermination of the Palestinians, and especially the Muslim Palestinians. Right? A free Kashmir, or let's say the India proper, the Hindutva dreams cannot exist without an ethnically cleansed Jammu and Kashmir. This is a structural issue. And alhamdulillah, it is not one that we have suffered in our history. That Islam and the governance of a place by Islamic norms and guidance is not predicated upon the eradication of the people that live there. We find this, even you could argue, to a fault in Islamic history. When the Muslims came to Iran and you had Zoroastrians, and Zoroastrians practiced incest, they had incestual marriages, and the Muslims actually tolerated it. And then when Islam came to India and everything that was being practiced there, you'll find a surprising amount of tolerance, almost an uncomfortable amount of tolerance for some of the things that were being practiced. And never was the spread of Islam, either politically or as a religion, predicated upon the extermination and the displacement of the people that were under their rule. So we have a duty to clarify this and to show this, and also a duty to keep the people of Bosnia in our minds and to keep contact with and keep up on what's going on there, so that the things that happened in the past do not reoccur. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Barakallahu feekum.